A word about our civic forum. This is an effort that we launched several years ago to try and serve as an anchor for important civil discourse. And so tonight is one more opportunity for us to model what that civil discourse and conversation looks like. I'd also welcome our audience that is streaming this around Colorado and around the country. We're glad that you join us here in sunny, if not a little blustery, Grand Junction. Before we get started, I need to thank a few folks without whom tonight would not be possible. First off, Rabbi Jay Streer and Jewish Colorado, Congregation Or Shalom here in Grand Junction, Michael Steinberg, who provided significant support to help make tonight possible, Michael Feiner and his remarkable contribution of the Triumphant Spirit exhibit that we're lucky enough to display. For those of you that didn't have a chance across the lobby tonight, the atrium, the display is literally just across the hallway here. And if you didn't have a chance on the way in, do stop there on the way out. It is a national treasure. The Triumphant Spirit is a series of photographs of Holocaust survivors. And so as we here at CMU are marking our 19th annual Holocaust Awareness Series, just a great opportunity for our community to see this national treasure that Mr. Feiner was nice enough to donate. And finally, a community leader and dear friend, Joe Bremen. Take Joe for a cup of coffee. He'll tell you the whole story about how tonight happened, but suffice it to say, Joe, thanks for your leadership in our community. So one might ask why a rural university like CMU would be hosting a Holocaust awareness series and a conversation with Bari Weiss, and it's a fair question. I'm guessing that many of us here grew up in more rural, maybe Protestant communities with few, if any, Jewish acquaintances, and the truth is that the heart of this conversation strikes at the heart of our independent spirit and ethic here in Western Colorado. An independent spirit that values good neighbors, values community, and fundamentally has a greater hope for our kids. And so my hope is tonight that we have an opportunity to reflect on our health as a community. Periodically you have to check in on those sort of things, right? It's like after the holidays, we've eaten too much, probably drank too much, haven't exercised nearly enough. We find ourselves a little out of breath at the top of the steps, maybe letting out our belt a notch or two. It's these little indicators that maybe our health is slipping. So it is with anti-Semitism. This is one of those ways where maybe we see a subtle social media post or some flyers that find their way around the community and we can quickly throw them in the trash or dismiss them. But the truth is, these are opportunities for us to pause and reflect on our health as a community. So my hope is that as we have this conversation tonight, Bari and David, that we're able to, in humility, all of us, check in and be able to hear this conversation with open hearts and open minds. So that's my commitment. I thank you all for joining us as part of this tonight. So David Foster is a great friend and longtime Colorado guy and community leader. He also happens to be one of my bosses as a trustee here at CMU. David, thank you for co-hosting tonight, and I'm going to kick it to you to introduce our friend Bari.
Well, thanks. And this is really such an extraordinary opportunity, and to, first of all, have leadership like John Marshall, and I know you've had a chance to spend the day and a half with John. We're really lucky to have him as our president. So we're really lucky to have John Marshall as our president. Absolutely. And being a Jewish guy from Denver, it's different for me being in Grand Junction, and I'm out here on a regular basis. knowing who you are, and of course we've just recently met, but I feel like I've kind of known you a lot of my life. This is really an extraordinary opportunity for me, and I'm super excited to be here to have this conversation with you. There is a page or two lengthy introduction of you, which I'm not going to do, because here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to kind of frame the opportunity for you to introduce yourself to this community. As John said, it's about humility. It's about kind of understanding who we are. And I have heard you for a couple of years now be able to describe who you are, to describe what motivates you, what has created the opportunity for you to be sitting in the middle of Grand Junction at Colorado Mesa University. I mean, not in your parents', yeah, I know you are. You know, growing up as a young person in Squirrel Hill, where, you know, most Jews in the world know of Squirrel Hill, but I'm guessing John doesn't. Tree of Life, the New York Times. So I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of introduce yourself to this community.
The long and short of it is that I'm a Jewish girl from Pittsburgh. I'll give you the slightly longer version, which is I grew up in Squirrel Hill, as David mentioned. If any of you know what the word shtetl is, think Fiddler on the Roof, Eastern European place where, or like Cheers, everybody knows each other's name. That was my community. It was literally Mr. Rogers' community. He lived half a mile from where I grew up. And it was an idyllic way to grow up. I imagine lots of you had experiences like that in much, much smaller places than even Squirrel Hill and Pittsburgh. I'm the oldest of 4 daughters. I grew up the product of a mixed marriage. My mother, a lifelong liberal, my dad, a Republican. They always canceled out each other's votes. My mom withheld sex in 2016 and then again in 2020 to make sure he wrote in a candidate rather than Trump. So I think the first year was Nikki Haley, the second year it was Steph Curry. That's my dad. Hi, Dad, if you're watching this. So that's the environment I grew up in. Suffice it to say, we talked a lot about politics in my house. We screamed at each other about politics. And also we loved each other very much. And I never knew that it would be possible to live in a family or a community or a culture where love and marriages and relationships would be put to political litmus tests. But of course, that's now the country many of us are living in. Fast forward many years. Well, I could maybe leave it there, but I could also take you on. Okay, I'm going to take you on a journey. I grew up in a family with very, very rooted in our Jewish identity and our Judaism. We were promiscuous Jews. What I mean by that has nothing to do with sexuality, but more about the fact that we loved going to different places for Shabbat services. So, you know, we'd go to an Orthodox shul that we belonged to and a conservative shul and a Reform synagogue, and it was all gravy. And I grew up, I would say, just very rooted in my place as a Jew and as my place as an American, and never saw those things ever as being in contradiction. In fact, you know, I remember every Passover in my house, my dad's kind of a historical dork, as am I, and he would print out things. Among them, he would print out the image that Benjamin Franklin wanted for the Great Seal of this country, which maybe some history buffs in the room will know. It was an image of Moses crossing the Red Sea, right? The founders imagined themselves to be new Israelites founding a new Jerusalem. Lincoln called America the almost promised land, right? The Americans were the almost chosen people. The reason for those references is because they read the Hebrew Bible. In other words, Americanism and my Judaism were just totally entwined and never felt like they were in contradiction. To fast forward maybe, and then we can maybe take the times and my career as a second question or another question. The morning of October 28th, 2019, a neo-Nazi walked into the synagogue where I became a bat mitzvah, Tree of Life. I'm sure some of you in the room remember that day or remember that name. And like many of you in this room, I'm sure we have a very active family text chain. And my youngest sister wrote, "There's a shooter, Tree of Life," and I immediately thought of my dad. There are 3 different communities that meet in that building, and he's often at one of them. Thank God he wasn't there, but my mom wrote back to the chain and said, "I'm sure we're going to know people." And my family knew 6 of the 11 people that were murdered. It was the most lethal attack on Jews in American history. And I write this in my book, and I feel this even more deeply today. It felt like the beginning of the end of my holiday from history, right? Like, I had always grown up aware that anti-Semitism was not just something that happened in other times. Of course, it's been a part of Western civilization since as long as we've been around, for reasons I can explain. But that, and that I was aware of it as something that happened in other places. My family talked all the time about what was going on with the Jews of France, and what was going on with the Jews in England, and what was going on facing Jewish communities all over the world. But wow, how lucky were we that we got to live in America. That even though, of course, there were ugly things, at the lunatic fringe, that in the main, this was a country that fundamentally rejected that. That in the main, we were a country that was uniquely inoculated from this poisonous virus, for whom Jews are sort of the immediate victim, but the surrounding society is the broader one. And after that morning, I sort of began to question that. I remember being a kid and waiting for the school bus to take me and my second sister to Jewish day school. And a Catholic school bus would drive by, and they called us kikes and dirty Jews. And I remember being in high school and someone telling me to pick up pennies, like little things that happen to people as they go through life. And anyone in this room that's a minority in any way is used to them. In some small way, they happen. And the question is, when they happen, do they roll off your back because you yourself feel so rooted and so confident in your place in a culture or a country? And that's what they were for me. Those things happened, but they didn't penetrate me because I thought, how embarrassing for that person. They don't get what America's about. They don't get what Pittsburgh's about. They don't get what Squirrel Hill's about. They don't get what this country's about. And I wondered, I guess, in the aftermath of the attack and then the subsequent attacks that have followed that we can discuss, whether or not that still remained true. And David, I suspect you, as many Jews from all political stripes across the country, have sort of started asking yourselves questions that you never thought you would ask yourself about being a Jew in America.
Yeah, without a doubt, without a doubt. And, as we had talked earlier, I remember taking my son to Sunday school the Sunday after it was a week later because Sunday school was delayed after that Shabbos, and just sitting in the parking lot bawling at the thought of having to send my son into the synagogue I grew up in, and wondering if he'd be safe, and seeing all of the police circling, that was somehow supposed to give me comfort that all of the police were there, and it gave me even less comfort. Yeah, we live in a very, very different world.
Yeah, and I think for those who aren't in the Jewish community, it can kind of come as a shock. I brought non-Jewish friends to synagogue or to places Jewish communities where I speak. They all have armed guards or at least metal detectors. And this is true whether you're in New York or Texas or Florida, it doesn't matter. That's the reality now of being in a Jewish space in America. And the question is, how did that become normal? Why did that become normal? And what can we do to reverse it?
Bari, I want to reflect on maybe a section in your book where you talk about anti-Semitism as this latent virus, right? That you don't notice when you feel good, when things are going well, but that starts to rear its head when things go sideways. And I wonder if you might follow that up a little bit and think about what are those precursors that allow the normalization of that kind of behavior?
Yeah, I think where it starts, I think there's a few things. The first thing I want to do is maybe define it for people, because I think it's important to understand what makes it different. Because I think there's a tendency, and I think it comes from a very good place, of wanting to understand anti-Semitism as just racism against Jews. And oftentimes it presents itself that way, like the story I just told you about being called a kike, or, quotas that used to exist in the Ivy League against Jews, which now exist against Asians. But that's a conversation for another time. Or, for example, not selling to Jews in certain neighborhoods. These are things that were normal in this country until basically half a century ago. That is racism against Jews, right? But the thing that is strange about anti-Semitism, right, is the racist imagines themselves as punching down, right? The homophobe is punching down. You're subhuman to me. The strange thing about anti-Semitism is the anti-Semite is punching down, but they're punching up at the same time. They're saying you're subhuman, and yet you control the world. You're subhuman, and yet you control the banks and the borders. You're subhuman, and yet you've developed, I just read this the other day online in the QAnon, 4chan world, of creating vaccines that are created by Zionists. They're going to kill all of us. You guys have heard this stuff. You're on social media. You know what's around. So that's the strange thing about it. And it's only by understanding anti-Semitism as a shape-shifting conspiracy theory that you understand how it can be contradictory, or seemingly so, right? Why is it that under communism, Jews are the arch-capitalists, they're the bourgeois? How is it that under Nazism, though, they're the race contaminators, they're the people that are sullying the true Aryan race? How is it that right now in this country, the far right says, as people did in Hitler's Germany, you are subhuman, you are the greatest trick the devil has ever played because you appear to be white, but in fact you're loyal to black people and brown people and Muslims. That's what the Pittsburgh killer believed, right? So we're being hunted by neo-Nazis, and yet at the very same time, the far left is saying, hold on, you Jews say you're a minority, but look how successful you are. Look how much power you have. Look at the way that you are adjacent to or uphold white supremacy. And look at the way you support Israel, which in their wrongful view is the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East. So you see how in the very same moment, the Jews are once targeted by neo-Nazis and they're turned into neo-Nazis, or they're accused of being neo-Nazis. So that's a very important feature to understand about what anti-Semitism is. Now, how does it begin to rear its head? Exactly as you said, John, it's when the immune system of a society is weakened. And our immune system in this country is weakened in 1,000 ways we could count. Tribalization, polarization, ideologies that suggest that some people are more American than others and some are less, or ideologies from the left that claim that some people are fundamentally victims and some people are fundamentally victimizers, and there's nothing we can do about it. Ideologies that are anti-human, that suggest that we are somehow constrained to the circumstances of our birth, or that we're guilty for the sins of our parents, right? These are ideas that are fundamentally, they're not just illiberal in the biggest sense of the word, they are anti-American. They are anti the very thing that, yes, makes this country exceptional. And so the further away we move from the ideals, obviously imperfect history, but the ideals that this country is meant to be based on, the idea that we're all created in the image of God, that we're all, equally deserving of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Like, this is the most radical departure in all of human history. Let's not forget that, even with all of the problems that we know that we have. And so I think it's like, the way I think about it is kind of like if history has a mean, and America's like here or here, depending on where you are politically, forget the spectrum, but we're a departure from it, right? We're something really special. A little bit the way I've felt over the past few years is that we're like being pulled back into the mean of history. We're being pulled back into tribalization, into being suspicious of our neighbors, into being paranoid about their intentions, about not assuming good faith, but assuming malicious intent, right? And about looking to point a finger. Because let's face it, there's a lot that's going on. There's a lot that's wrong. There's inequality. There's technological change that's fundamentally transforming our relationship to one another and what it means to be human and what it means to have work that matters and what it means to have dignity. It's not by coincidence that in times of tremendous political and economic change, anti-Semitism is often not far around the corner, because people are often looking for a scapegoat to understand why life is so unfair or why they've gotten a bad lot in life. And you can bet the anti-Semite is going to be there to hand them the excuse, and that excuse or that scapegoat is almost always going to be the Jews.
Bari, there are probably some people in this audience tonight who are hearing you speak for the first time. And my guess is you're starting to get a sense as to why she's become one of the most powerful voices, frankly, in the world around this particular topic. But you didn't just show up here out of nowhere. Can you walk us through how you got here? I mean, today...
I took 2 flights. There was a layover in Phoenix. I had a McDonald's.
Bari was very confused why she had to have connecting flights to get to Grand Junction, which everybody in this room can educate you on. But you are holding this really unique and rare space, and yet the way you got here is maybe just as interesting as the work you're doing today. So would you take a second?
Sure.
And from that moment, walking us through some of your personal journey and walk us through that professional journey in terms of how you have got to become the podcast and the Substack and this huge following. Like, how did this happen?
Coincidence. And yeah, it's serendipity. But now that I look back, also maybe some sort of bigger mission, I don't know. It really did begin with serendipity. I was a student at Columbia University. I came to campus very much identifying as a political progressive. I had spent a gap year between high school and college in Israel, in Jerusalem, and then working on a kibbutz right near the border with Gaza. It was a very intense time to be there. It was the end of the Second Intifada. It was the outbreak of the Iraq War. We were fitted for gas masks. It was intense. There were bombings, things like that. I came to campus thinking, I'm going to be a musical theater major. I don't want to do politics. It's enough. I'm sick of it. I had enough. And as I said before, I grew up talking about politics. But then I noticed, a thing that now all of us recognize throughout the culture, which goes by many names, critical social justice, wokeness, illiberalism, call it whatever you want. I started to encounter that. And I started to encounter basically people telling me that it wasn't possible for me to be a good person and to be a good progressive and to believe that the state of Israel had a right to exist and defend itself. And that sort of sent me on a journey of, wait, what is going on here? How is it that I'm in conversations with feminists that are justifying wearing burqas? What is this worldview? Because it doesn't seem liberal, even though they claim that they are. Long story short, I started writing for the school paper. I started a magazine, and I started debating people on campus, which was quite fun. And I remember a particular debate against the campus Marxists, and I think in a lot of ways I just didn't make sense to people, right? And I think maybe that's still the case, and maybe why I confound people, because I'm Jewish. I've always thought I was liberal. I'm gay. I'm married to a woman. That's my life. You would think that I'm liberal and I would just go along with the flow. It's like, I look like them, I think like them, I eat at the same restaurants, but I don't think all the same things. And I'm not scared to say when I disagree. And I think that's really pissed people off throughout my career. Anyway, I was debating the campus Marxists, and there was an older gentleman in the back of the room, and he basically said to me, you don't know me, but I'm telling you, you should go be an intern for my son, Bret Stephens, who writes the foreign affairs column at the Wall Street Journal. Now, I had never read the Wall Street Journal. I thought it was a finance paper. I can basically tell you nothing about finance, even though I worked there for a decade. But I did go and work for Bret Stephens. And that began my career in journalism. Now, for those of you who don't know the Wall Street Journal, it's many more things other than a financial paper. It's an excellent newspaper, and it's a conservative editorial page. So I was kind of like the resident liberal and a conservative editorial page. There's something I think about me that is comfortable being a little bit out of step with the people around me. And, they kind of lovingly referred to me as a squish. And I was pretty happy there. Then the phenomenon of Donald Trump happened. And the long and short of it is, because you guys saw it play out in the broader Republican Party or in the conservative movement. That same sort of reckoning or civil war, however you want to describe that, happened inside the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And the upshot of it was that many people ended up leaving, including me. Where did I go? Well, I went from the frying pan into the fire. I went from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times. Now, why the hell did I do that? I did that for two reasons. One was it's the New York Times. It's the biggest newspaper in the world, whether you love it or whether you hate it. And trust me, I have opinions about it. The second reason was that the New York Times was genuinely going through a soul-searching moment. Anyone that remembers the election night in January in 2016 will remember the infamous needle, right? You watched and it told you, Nate Silver told us, that Hillary Clinton had a 99.9% of winning the election. And I remember my mom calling me the weeks before, and for her work, she has to drive sort of 2 hours outside of Pittsburgh, which is where I grew up. And she called me and said, I don't care what people in your office are telling you, Donald Trump is winning this election. So how did my mom see what the paper of record, the most important newspaper in the world, couldn't? Well, the New York Times was asking themselves the same question. And so I was brought in as a kind of intellectual diversity hire to bring in the kind of pieces that wouldn't otherwise appear in the paper. I'm serious. I know that's crazy because you guys actually live around Republicans. I was like as close to a conservative as they could get. Like I was Trump to these people. So that really gives you a sense of the bubble that exists inside the New York Times. Let me put it to you this way. Like there were people that didn't even talk to me from the beginning of the time that I worked there because I was seen as so far and crazy to the right. I mean, gives you a sense of where they were. So I wasn't cool, suffice it to say, from the beginning of my time there. But that was okay with me. I had been used to sort of like not being invited to sit with the popular girls at the Mean Girls table. I was used to being a dork in middle school. That was fine. Like I got to work at the New York Times and I got to, oh my God, like publish my pieces there and bring in people that would not otherwise appear in it. Someone made a joke. Maybe you guys know the Muslim dissident Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's an unbelievable woman from Somalia. And she used to joke with her husband, the historian Neil Ferguson, that I was a coyote because I could smuggle people across the border. And that's what I did at the New York Times. That was my job. So why did I leave? Why the hell would anyone leave the New York Times? I mean, lots of people in this room can imagine why. And I'm sure lots of people in this broader community can imagine why. But my grandma is still smarting from it and does not understand why I left. Her allegiance is with Rachel Maddow, God bless. But, she's politically aligned against me, let's just say. I left because the very reason that I became a journalist, which was the ability to pursue my curiosity, the ability to write about things, even when they were politically inconvenient to the powers that be, the ability to go to dark corners and uncover things that powerful interests didn't want to be exposed, the ability to say things that might not be pleasing to a mob online. All of those things became impossible. And they became impossible for the reasons I'm sure everyone in this room knows because you watch it play out on the internet or maybe in your own community. In the very hot, very morally panicked summer of 2020, the New York Times decided to run an op-ed by Republican Senator Tom Cotton. And the op-ed was called Send in the Troops, and it was a very controversial headline, but he basically called for the National Guard to be brought in to put down violent riots, not peaceful protests, violent riots. Again, like I said, it was a controversial piece. I had nothing to do with it, but I thought to myself, yeah, it makes sense that we would run a piece like this. Very influential Republican, definitely has aspirations to be president one day. This is an important subject, and yeah, it's not just peaceful protests. There's rioting going on. Everyone can see it with their eyes. Well, within 72 hours of this op-ed being printed, my boss, who had been the Jerusalem bureau chief and was in line to be the executive editor at the paper, was pushed out of the paper. His deputy was demoted. The 25-year-old editor, who's a star, who had worked on the piece, was hung out to dry and ultimately left the paper. And 800 of my colleagues signed a letter saying this op-ed literally put their lives in danger. I thought to myself, wait, so I'm working at a place where the coin of the realm is language, and yet people are saying that language is violence and words are violence. But actual violence, actual rioting, is not violence. That's something else. And if you want, by the way, the full blossom of that ideology, just look at what happened with Will Smith and Chris Rock, in which we were told to believe that, somehow was justified because words are violence and jokes about alopecia are what are we talking? What weird world have I stumbled into? That's what I thought to myself, honestly. They signed this letter and I thought, where am I working? This is not something that journalists would ever say, or at least how I imagine journalists. Now, in a normal, sane world, the publisher of any newspaper that's employing people that say words hurt me, words cause violence against me, words literally put my life in danger, would say, it's been very nice working with you, here is the door. Instead, what happened is the story that we're seeing inside so many institutions, which is the kind of hijacking of historically liberal institutions by a very illiberal group that fundamentally doesn't believe in the mission. Anyway, I watched all of this played out and I thought to myself, I have a choice to make. I can stay. And in where I lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, Seinfeld territory, telling people you worked at the New York Times really meant something. Got you a good table at a good restaurant, among other things. And it meant a lot to me because I felt like, wow, like I made it. Or I could leave and I could give up the prestige, give up the platform, have no plan for what I'm doing next, but leave with my integrity and leave knowing that I'm kind of, not compromising myself, not self-censoring myself, not doing the very things that would betray why I began this profession in the first place. So I left with a resignation letter sort of heard around the world. It was my Jerry Maguire moment. And now I'm here and I'm sitting here with you guys and I feel the freest that I've ever felt in my life. And I'm building a media company that hopefully will kind of pick up the flag that places like the New York Times have put down by pursuing the truth without fear of favor and actually fulfilling the motto of all the news that's fit to print, not all the news that suits the narrative.
To say what you did was brave is obviously an understatement. Many of us, I promise, we've all had those moments where we've wanted to do that, we've thought about that, we've not done it, we've not had our Jerry Maguire moment. In fact, some of us late night have gotten into spats with other people on Facebook and instead, right, and that's bad enough. I was going to, I'd like to, I want to come back and speak about anti-Semitism for a second. Sure. And ask you this question. It's my one question, my one sentence question. Is there room for Jews to still be victims? And what I mean by that, and I'm sure you know what I mean by that, is I'm a Jew. And I feel oftentimes like I have to remind folks that we are still a minority. Mm-hmm. And that things happen to many of us. And some of it gets covered and some of it doesn't get covered. And I know that you've gone to great lengths to speak about, some of the, Hasidic communities that aren't quite looking like you and me, don't have some of the same newspaper coverage when bad things happen to their communities. So maybe you can speak to that question.
Yeah, and I can connect it to my own experience really at the Times. The moment that I knew I was going to have to leave was actually not the Tom Cotton moment. It was when I had written a column maybe 6 months prior, it might have even been 9 months, and it was about a spate of anti-Semitic attacks that had taken place in the New York area. And they were very violent attacks. They were things like someone getting their face beaten in with a paving stone in broad daylight in Brooklyn, or a man with a machete walking into a Hanukkah gathering an hour and a half north of Times Square and killing people with the machete. And it was people walking into a kosher supermarket in Jersey City and murdering everyone in the grocery store. So I'm not talking about little microaggressions. And I wrote this column, and I remember going into my editor's office, and it was a damn good column, and they basically said, we're not running it. And the reason is simple. The Jews in those cases were inconvenient victims. And the reason they were inconvenient was that they weren't assaulted or murdered by white supremacists, right? When the person carrying out the attack, or when anti-Semitism, at least in liberal quarters, that's what I'm speaking to right now, comes from the far right, it's morally clear, at least in a place like the New York Times. It's very different in other contexts. But what happens when the person carrying out the attack is a person of color? What happens if the person carrying out the attack is themselves coming from another minority that can be victimized? Well, that's more complicated, right? And if you've already submitted yourself to an ideology that's Manichaean, right, that's binary, that says that you're either, morally pure or not, depending on the color of your skin or your gender or your sexual orientation, and the more sort of status you have as a victim, the more morally pure you are, or the more claim to truth you have. You've already given up the game. So David, the answer is that if you believe in an ideology like that, there is no room for Jews to be victims. But if you believe in an ideology, a worldview that views people as individuals with individual dignity, that judges people based on their character, there absolutely is. I'll just tell you one more thing. The atmosphere that I got used to at the New York Times, you have to imagine this is a place where they care deeply about things like getting people's pronouns right and making sure that everyone is sensitive and that there's gender neutral bathroom. This is the most highly sensitive, politically correct environment in the world, and yet people would say to me, are you writing about the Jews again? And yet I'd be in Slack message boards with thousands of people, including the masthead of the paper, and people would ask when I'm getting fired and put axe emojis next to my name. Isn't that a microaggression? But no, right? No. And that's because, again, we don't fit quite into that box. And if your only understanding of discrimination is about race, then we're shoved into the box with white people. Despite the fact that, as the FBI counts, since 1995, Jews represent the largest number of religiously motivated hate crimes of any other group every year, year after year. Hate crimes against Jews in New York City have quadrupled in the past few years. Every single number bears this out. So why do the people that pledge, social justice at every turn not seem to care about us? Why are there never hashtags that go viral defending the Jewish people? The answer's in my book, but hopefully I've sort of answered it, which is to say that, again, to me, it all comes back to whether or not you are submitting yourself to an ideology that sees people as better or worse based on their group identity, rather than seeing them as individuals with individual dignity and humanity.
So, thanks for that answer. So I've read a lot of books on anti-Semitism in my life, as you can well imagine. Yeah, I'm super fun, super fun. We had to read them, you know that. We went to Sunday school. The thing that
I've also read a lot of books about
I know you
anti-Semitism.
have. I know you have. I've never read a book quite like this.
Oh, thank
okay,
you.
and let me tell you why, and let me evidence an issue in here. You spend the first 5 chapters citing chapter and verse as to how there is anti-Semitism, what is anti-Semitism, many of the things that you've spoken about tonight. But then you do something really extraordinary. You go to chapter 6 on page 164. 164.
It's a short book, I promise.
Yes.
It's almost at the end of
Yes.
it.
And you start to speak to what we can do to fight anti-Semitism, right? Because enough of the talk of it, what can we do? And you identify a number of things. I'd like you to discuss, what from that list is for Jews and what from that list is for all, because I think that it does kind of break apart. But you do mention one thing: praise those who do the right thing. And we have. I know that you've probably wanted to throw out a couple of Hebrew words in this setting. There's this word hineni, right? And hineni is, I'm here. You raise your hand, you say, I'm here. And in this particular requirement and ask, praise those who do the right thing. John Marshall, right? He has done the right thing by bringing you here. And it is incumbent on our community to accept that, acknowledge that, support that. And I'm curious as to, I just wanted to get that out, because I think that's really meaningful, that he does live many of those kinds of suggestions that you make. But speak to the, what are a couple of takeaways that you can mention to a community that is, I'm guessing, mostly not Jewish, that they can do to help fight anti-Semitism?
I guess to begin that answer, I want to go back to Pittsburgh and what I witnessed in the days following the attack. I was supposed to fly to Israel to do a big story about a really important and fascinating archaeological dig called the City of David. I ended up writing about it months later, but of course I went back to Pittsburgh. And I wrote some pieces about it, and then I went on Bill Maher that Friday night, and honestly that week transformed my life. And, the reason it transformed my life was not primarily because I saw such heartache, although I did. And it's not just because, like many Americans, I've gotten numb to gun violence and violence. And I know myself, when I hear about something, a horrible mass shooting, it's like you hear it and then you move on. But seeing it in your own community, seeing like Anderson Cooper on your friend's lawn doing a TV spot, makes you remember that those places are not just names, like they're a whole world for people. So it wasn't just because of that. It was honestly because I was so deeply moved by the visceral reaction of other people in Pittsburgh who are not Jews. I watched as people understood in a visceral way that an attack on the Jewish community was an attack on them. Why? Because an attack on the Jewish community meant that difference is not acceptable here, right? Jews historically have represented the idea of freedom, the freedom to be different, to worship differently, to wear sometimes weird clothes and weird things on our head, to believe differently, to structure the week differently, and so on and so forth. And so the really good rule of thumb is where Jews thrive, freedom thrives. Where Jews thrive, diversity, real diversity, not just in name, thrives. And there was a deep understanding of that reality in Pittsburgh. That's how, I went to a funeral of two brothers who were killed, and I watched as members of the Steelers, were the pallbearers. I saw in the newspaper, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the words in Hebrew script of the mourner's prayer written on the front page. I saw as members of the Muslim community were gathered, or the pastor from Emmanuel, the church, with the horrible massacre that happened there, show up to say, we're with you and we love you. That's the kind of thing I saw over and over and over again. And so, while at first glance, what happened in Pittsburgh looks like something straight out of 19th century Eastern Europe, right? It does. Looks like a pogrom. That's what those kinds of attacks are called. But historically, what would happen was the attack would happen, and the people in the community would abet it, would join in, or would just stand by. the opposite of that happened in Pittsburgh. And that for me was extremely important to see and to witness and to let into my heart. Because it was really easy in that moment to go to a really dark place, but to see that, oh wow, this is what it makes America different. This is the departure from history that we always hope for and strive for in this country. So that's the first sort of thing, of recognizing when people do the right thing. I think that's really important. The other thing is, we can go to your favorites, but one of the things I think a lot about is, don't ask things of yourself that you wouldn't ever ask of another minority. I think there's a tendency in the Jewish community to be really good allies to other groups. You know, obviously we were talking earlier today about your dad who marched with Martin Luther King on the march to Selma, right? And you should take so much pride in that. And Jews do take so much pride in our involvement in things like the civil rights movement. But that doesn't mean that we should self-erase ourselves or be self-abnegating or shrink ourselves to fit in, right? We should ask other people to join in with us, and for sure we should never shrink ourselves to fit into any room. And that, I think, is a really, really important lesson to hold right now. I don't know, there's so many things that I think about, but for me, a big one is also what I was saying earlier in the conversation, which is really an understanding that the moral guardrails that keep bigotry down have been dismantled, and we need to think really hard about how to rebuild those in our lives. And that's something that I'm thinking about a tremendous amount, because I think one thing that people anti-Semitism, bad for the Jews, right? That's how a lot of Jews think about it. But you have to think for a moment beyond that, right? Think about societies in history where anti-Semitism has flourished. Those are societies that are dead. They're not here anymore, right? And that's why I think it's so important, whether you're a Jew, whether you're not a Jew, whether I'm the first Jew you've met, hello, or David, that understand that a society where conspiracy thinking, that's what this is, right? A society where people believe that there's secret cabals of politicians that eat babies, and that's become a normal thing that people believe, that is not a good sign about where this country is heading. You know, a society that sort of has untethered itself from truth. Not good. We got to figure out how to get back to truth, how to get back to having conversations with each other, how to get back to sort of looking at each other with full humanity. And that to me is one of the most important things we can do right now. Not refusing to believe any ideology, politician, otherwise, that suggests to you that some people are evil and some people are good. No. We're all evil and we're all good. That is down every human heart.
Barry, we're on a college campus, and you have written and talked and had hosts and a variety of others where you have, I think, critiqued in very direct and sharp ways what I think you've described as the devolution of universities, and they're losing the breakdown of institutions. And so we've got a variety of faculty, students, those of us that are here on this campus, participate in this campus. I think in full humility, I want to provide you with that opportunity to both critique and encourage us in what our path ought to look like as an institution. And while I do that, I'm going to give you a chance to answer. We're going to take a few minutes and take questions from the audience. So those of you that want to ask a question, there's some microphones on either side of the room, and if you want to start queuing up while Barry answers this questions, we'll take a few questions.
I also would love to see who's ever asking the question when you do.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. Can you see?
You can't see?
No, just the light.
No, I'm just kidding. That's blinding. No, it's...
Oh, yes,
there we go.
beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I can see my friends now. That's good.
All right, so you want me to slam CMU and higher ed in general?
Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing.
I was hoping you would talk about how CMU is a diamond.
It's a
in the
great
rough.
hope.
What,
So I'm here
what do
to
we need
announce
to
that
do
I'm
to get
coming
better?
on as a professor. No. No, but I do think John and I have been talking all day, and I do think there's a huge opportunity. Look, you don't need to pay much attention to the news or to read my Substack or listen to my podcast to know that higher ed is in absolute crisis. They are. And it's not just higher ed, right? For sure, it's the most elite universities, but it's a lot of others besides. It's also, the ideological takeover of the publishing industry, of the media business, of parts of medicine and the law. I mean, this is very serious stuff, what's happening in this country right now. There's a reason that I'm banging on about it all day. So really serious, and higher ed, I think, is arguably the most important of all, because this is where we breed people's minds. This is where people are shaped, not just their mind, but their soul. And if you're going during the most formative years of your intellectual and moral development into an atmosphere of ideological homogeneity, where dissent is punished, where, as one Harvard student said to me the other day, I feel like I'm in the Soviet Union. I had to write him at his personal email because he was too nervous that Harvard was spying on his other one, and that didn't seem that paranoid to me, honestly. So that's where a lot of these schools that claim to be the best liberal arts educations in the country are right now. They're illiberal. They have betrayed their mission, which is the pursuit of truth. And guess what? You can't pursue the truth if everyone already comes in believing the same thing. You can't pursue the truth, right? The whole thing about how we arrive at truth is the confrontation of disagreement, right? That's how everything is arrived at, whether it's scientific discovery or moral discovery or anything else, really. It's about friction. You need that. And if truth is an orthodoxy that's already known, and I'm just there to become a zombie, well, why would I pay $70,000 a year to do that? I hear it's much cheaper to come here. So I guess what I would say is, in their failure, there's a lot of opportunity for new things. I really believe that. There's just so much opportunity, first of all, for diamonds in the rough that have been overlooked to sort of stand up and say, hey, you professor there at fancy school that's scared to speak your mind, come here. This will be a better atmosphere for you. Or new things being built. I'm on the board of a new university in Austin that, as I was telling these guys earlier, has received 4,000 applications from professors in 3 months from other universities in America. Why? And some of these are very fancy brand name schools, because they can't speak their mind, because they felt just like I felt at the New York Times, and because they're looking at themselves in the mirror and think, why did I get into this gig to begin with? Did I get into it to, shut up? No, it's not why you become a professor. You certainly don't become a professor for the money. So I just think that there's an unbelievable opportunity right now for places like CMU and others to make themselves meccas for the very things that these other places have betrayed. And I just see enormous optimism and hope in that possibility.
Appreciate that encouragement. The optimism part, anyway. If there are questions, there's microphones on either side. We're happy to take a couple. We don't have time for many, but I would also say to try and keep your questions concise, and I think we have time for two or three.
Even as we were talking, just one thing, like even we were talking about before, can you go to Harvard or Yale right now and have a debate about critical race theory, whether trans people should participate in gendered sports, the current law that's being put forth in Florida about K through 3 education? Can you talk about these things openly there? The answer is no. I'll tell you, it's not. So imagine if you had debates like that here. Like, no one else is doing. I guess my thing is, none of those people are doing it anymore. And doing those things is just like about the most generative and wonderful thing in the world. Like that, I love being in the intellectual arena. I love debating. I think it's just so incredible. And I think that, just look at all, like the field's wide open is, I guess, my way of saying it. It is wide open right now in a way that would have been unimaginable, I think, even 2 decades ago.
Maybe we could talk Brett Stevens' dad into coming.
Yes, he passed, but we could have Brett come. Okay.
We have a question over here, looks like.
Hi.
Hi, Bari.
Hi.
Have a question. You are obviously a fan of healthy discourse, and recently you made a tweet defending a friend who is also an author, and in the last sentence you said, it took me a while to make my opinion publicly known out of fear of cancel culture, basically was the takeaway. What would you say would be your recommendation for showing up in our society, in this culture that becomes more and more prevalent, it seems?
I think you're thinking of my friend Abigail Schreier, is that right?
I am.
Okay. So amazing to think back to that. She's since become her and her husband, 2 of our closest friends in Los Angeles. And I felt really embarrassed. And I apologized to her because basically I felt in the main she was so right, so ahead of the curve about such an important topic. And I knew that I would take a reputational hit by defending her. And it took me too long to do it. She wasn't expecting anything of me, by the way. She's like such a good person. But I felt like, wait, hold on. I pride myself on telling the truth as I see it. Why didn't I do it in that case? Why did it take me so long? Now, subsequently, she's published a lot in my Substacks. She's been on my podcast. Like, I'm such a huge believer and supporter of hers. But the reason I didn't do it is probably, or fast enough, is probably the reason that a lot of people in this room have hesitated to say things on the internet. It's because there's like no winning in a lot of these platforms. There's really not. And you know that you'll take the reputational hit, or you know that if you say a thing to one side, you'll just get screaming from the other. And it's really like a hard room, right? It's just like really a hard place to be because there's very little benefit that comes from it. I think what I'm trying to do in my own life, and I'm constantly having to push myself to do the courageous or the right thing, really. It's not even courageous, it's just right, is just to model it for other people, right? And Abigail does this amazingly in her own life and work. So do other people. J.K. Rowling comes to mind as one, but there's lots of people that are doing it. And in the hope that by showing people that you are bigger than the noise of trolls online, and in fact they can't touch you, that hopefully you give inspiration and hope and courage to younger people that are confronting this in their own way, in their own life. I wish I could stand up here and tell you that I have a solution to the economic model of big tech, which is to make all of us hate each other more and to make us fall into rage spirals and think that other people are our enemy, but I don't, other than making them public utilities. I don't have a solution to that right now. What I know is that just trying to model behavior in my own life that is courageous and brave and correct, and this is a rule inside my company also that I recommend to all of you. Act online the way you act in real life, always. For some reason, people think that when they get behind an avatar, like we're not going to know it's you. Like we know it's you, and I think that's just tremendously important. And then the other thing I would say is just the extent possible, get offline. And I don't often share this, but I will say, like, early on when I was at the Times and I was just starting to use Twitter and get, no one wants to be, as they call it on Twitter, the main character of the day. That means you said something stupid or that Twitter perceives to be stupid. I was the main character on many a day. And there were days that I just didn't want to get out of bed. It was really, really hard because we're, to be a good journalist is to be empathetic to hearing other people's voices, and all of a sudden all the voices are telling you you're a monster. It's really rough. And one of the things that's been like the biggest things in my life beyond my family and my community is getting back into my religious practice, getting offline from sundown on Friday night to sundown on Saturday, and not being near the internet. Like, that's really helped me. And whether whether that day is Saturday or Sunday or no day, the day of your choice, I highly recommend it. It's been sort of like life-saving for me in a certain way. So again, I wish I had a more complete answer. Those are just a few of the things that have helped me. But I'll give one last thing, which is you don't always have to make yourself a martyr, and you don't always have to say every single thing that's on your mind. Those are two things I would say. And so, seeking out people privately, there's a lot of people who write me and say, I want to retweet you, but I just can't risk my job. I totally get that. I really do. Politics shouldn't be everyone's profession. And the fact that we've all been turned into nonstop political pundits is a sign of a bad thing in our culture. So I think often even reaching out to people personally and privately can be a really good thing too. Also, I love your haircut.
Well, thank you
We'll
for
go
being
over
here.
next.
So I think we've all heard some comments from the United States president that he's had to backpedal, and maybe that's not really what he meant. And recently, the president of Russia made one of those comments that he had to kind of take a step back on, and that was about the denazification of Ukraine. And I was curious how you, as a Jew, kind of felt about comments like that being made, and what underlying truths there may be to statements like that coming from Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, well, Vladimir Putin has used the lunatic argument of claiming that Ukraine is actually full of Nazis as a pretext for a war of aggression. So that's ridiculous, and Vladimir Putin and Russian forces are murdering innocent people in ways that are horrific. And somehow we've moved on. After 3 weeks, we went from Ukraine now to the slap, and now we're on Disney, and who knows what'll be next week. It's also true that Ukraine is not just like a hunky-dory liberal democracy, and there are groups like the Azov Battalion and such that are, don't have a great track record. I'm not an expert on Ukraine, but what I will say is that the pretext is totally bunk, that this is a war of aggression, and that, I didn't know the name Zelensky, frankly. I knew vaguely who he was before this started, but I think he has shown the world, what courage looks like, what fighting for the thing you believe in looks like, and I think that's just been, personally, I would say, unbelievably inspiring to me, and I think to a lot of people who have felt like, is there a West still worth fighting for? Is there a liberal order worth fighting for? And I think him and the Ukrainian people have roared back, and the answer is yes. I wrote a piece about this called Things Worth Fighting For, and I think watching him and the example of ordinary Ukrainians, and also, frankly, Americans I know who have gone over to cook at the border with Jose Andres' World Kitchen, or to work to resettle refugees in places like Moldova and Hungary and Poland, or veterans I know that have gone over to help. I think what's happening in Ukraine and the way they are pushing back against a superpower is just unbelievably inspiring.
We've got time for about one more question.
You know what? We could take all of them. I'll answer. I'll do a popcorn because I feel bad because people are waiting.
Do you want to pop? Can you guys ask quick questions?
If you ask them real quick, I'll answer them all at once.
Give me a thumbs up.
No. But
Speak truth to power.
I'm pretty nervous about asking in front of a whole bunch of people anyways, so I can give it to someone else.
You're doing a great job. Take
Thanks.
your time.
It's not a short question, though.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Well, I suppose, first of all, it's nice to meet you.
You too.
I learned a lot from this discussion today. I feel pretty lucky in my education so far. I've had a lot of different views, and being able to listen to all of them and learn from all of them has been really special, even though if maybe not all of those views agree with each other. And it's weird for me coming to college and meeting people who maybe aren't able to listen to different views. And I guess the best explanation of that is I call it blacklisting. Like someone might blacklist someone for saying something insensitive. Maybe cancel culture is the best term. I'm not really sure. But I don't know how to go about having conversations with people who blacklist, and I know them and I care about them. So maybe, do you have any ideas?
Great question. First of all, that was totally a question.
Thank you.
Let's maybe take a few and then I'll answer them. I'll take all 4 questions of people standing up. Yeah.
Thank you for visiting our community, and thank you to CMU for hosting this event. I think it speaks very well for CMU as an institution. My question is, the situation at the New York Times that you encountered, the intolerance for dissent, to what degree is that we've bantered words around like woke, politically correct, illiberal. To what degree is it Marxist-Leninist? Especially maybe considering the New York Times' long history of friendly coverage towards Marxist-Leninist regimes going back to the Ukrainian famine in the 1930s.
Got it.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Jewish, and I grew up in an ethnic neighborhood that wasn't Jewish. I was one of the few Jewish kids, and I experienced anti-Semitism from young age on. I'm curious how you see it changing, that Einstein repeating the same behavior and expecting a different result. Being nice to each other, trying to listen, that sounds good, but how are we going to change something that's been going on for thousands of years?
Yep. I'm going to answer all these in 30 seconds. You're not going to believe it.
There you go. As well you should. A question is poor substitute for a conversation. I would love to have a conversation, and unfortunately that's out of the realm. So let me just point to the gentleman who was here previously who mentioned Marxism, Leninism, and my significant interest is liberal education, and you mentioned liberal education. Liberal education is something that's difficult to put your finger on with anything definitive. Mm-hmm. I watched the hearings for Judge Jackson not very long ago. Senator Cruz raised the issue about critical theory, critical race theory. The judge pleaded complete ignorance. Mm-hmm. Senator Cruz demonstrated significant ignorance regarding the topic. These are liberal education issues. What, in your mind, is liberal education, and why are 2 people at the pinnacle of our government really unable to have an intelligent conversation about Marxism, the Frankfurt School, Habermas, the things that they have to offer intellectually, and the things that everybody seems to miss when they have any kind of attempted conversation?
We're going to get into the Frankfurt School now. Okay, no. Here's the brief answer to that. They both know better. It's political theater. The reason that Ted Cruz is waving around Ibram Kendi's baby book about how babies are racist and anti-racist is theater. And when Ketanji Brown Jackson says she doesn't know what a woman is, it's the same thing, right? When she says there's no critical race theory, it's semantics. Everyone knows they're not literally teaching Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw to 5th graders. They're teaching the fruits of critical race theory. They're teaching the praxis of critical race theory. And by the way, of course they are. Of course they are. So the reason in that case is, in that realm, you do have to be a little cynical. That's plain politics, and that's 100% what's going on there. As for the New York Times, I got to be honest with you. I see online lots of people describing it in the terms that you did, Marxist, Leninist. I don't really care about the terms that much, to be honest with you. I care about what I'm seeing and the fact that people can't do their jobs and they're scared. And I don't care if we call that Marxist, Leninist, illiberal, successor ideology. Some Wesley Yang has called the new illiberal ideology woke, critical social justice. All I know is that it is turning people against each other. It's making people hate each other. And it's causing people all over this country to call me crying, saying, I'm in the closet. What? How'd that happen? So again, for me, it's less about the way we're describing it, although you're totally right about the famine in Ukraine. And there's a wonderful film called Mr. Jones, actually, about it. I don't know how it got made, but somehow it did. It's worth looking up. So again, it's not particularly the New York Times. It's everywhere. It's everywhere in blue America, which is where I live and where all my friends live. And it has a different valence in red America, but it's the same story. Right? We're living in different realities. We're living in different realities where we think people that disagree with us are wrong and bad, and that is the thing that I'm focused on more than anything else. But you're right about the history of the New York Times, for sure. And there's a very good book by a writer called Ashley Rinsberg that came out recently that I would also recommend about the New York Times and its ideology. As for the question that was here, what do we do to stop it? We're repeating history again. We're never going to get rid of anti-Semitism. Sorry, it's never happening. What we can do is rebuild the healthy immune system that keeps anti-Semitism at bay. And that is really my focus, and I think should be the focus of everyone that cares about this country, really. And it goes back to what I was saying just now. We can't expect that Jews or anyone is going to be safe in a country in which we don't have a shared understanding of truth, or we don't have a shared understanding that we're all created in the image of God. That's fundamental. So that, to me, is where I think the focus of everyone who cares about this country, no matter who you vote for, needs to be. As for the question of blacklisting and cancel culture, it's a really hard thing, especially for people that grew up on the internet. It used to be that college students would tell me about how they're self-censoring, then it was high school students, now it's middle school students. Actually, they tell me, I want to get into the good high school, so I'm just going to tweet hashtag whatever. I just want to be accepted by my friends, so I'm just not going to say what I feel about X, Y, and Z issue. I'm just going to go along with it because this was an actual story the other day, because I don't want to get kicked out of Harry Potter book club. Okay? It's on every level of society. And I don't really think there's any way around it other than courage. I just don't. I wish there was. I wish I could tell everyone in this room that there's some secret sauce or algorithm, although getting offline is a really good thing. But ultimately, I really think it's about people coming out as being normal. What is normal? Normal is just thinking for yourself, believing commonsensical things, believing that you can be friends with people that think differently than you, and that doesn't make you a bad person, and that you don't need to disavow family members or friends because they happen to vote differently than you, right? Being normal means thinking that there are things that are bigger than politics, like art and love and friendships and relationships and music, and that those things are the essence of life, and that politics isn't everything. Being normal is saying, I refuse to have my life ruled by politics, or ruled by a party, or ruled by a politician. That's something else. That's like a cult. I don't want to be down with that. That's just not my thing. And I think that the more people that can do that, and remember that that's the majority of Americans are not the people screaming at each other on social media. The majority of Americans are exhausted by what they're seeing on social media. And the more people that can come out as being what I think of as just normies, I think the better off we're going to be, the healthier the country is going to become. And based on the applause, I suspect that there are lots of people like that in this room.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you help me thank Bari Weiss for coming to Grand Junction and Colorado Mesa University. Thank you, Bari.